Welcome to the shadow frequency, where the veil between this world and the next grows thin, and the things that whisper in the dark are given voice. From the cryptic candlelit studios, deep in the Indiana forests, your host, Matt Wilson, and his spectral producer, Juniper Ravenwood, unearth the forbidden, the forgotten, and the fearsome. So, still your heart, dim the light, and listen closely. For once you tune into the shadow frequency, you may never tune out.
This weekend, America celebrates a birthday, not just another 4th of July. Not just another summer weekend filled with fireworks, cookouts, flags hanging from front porches, and the sound of somebody down the road setting off something that was probably not purchased at the little fireworks tent beside the grocery store. This year marks 250 years since the Declaration of Independence announced to the world that 13 colonies intended to become something entirely different, the United States of America. And because this is a holiday weekend, we're doing things a little differently here on the Shadow Frequency. Juniper Ravenwood has the weekend off. Chris Beach has the weekend off. Not that July 4th really makes any difference to him, being English, but hey, maybe it does. I guess it does in a way. So tonight, it's just me, Matt. One microphone, one file, and 5 strange stories connected to the birth, the symbols, the leaders, and the haunted ground of the United States. Because America has always been a country surrounded by stories. Stories of destiny, stories of providence, stories of signs hidden in plain sight, and stories suggesting that sometimes the men and women who helped create this country may not have completely left it behind. So wherever you're listening tonight, maybe you're sitting outside after the fireworks, maybe you're driving home beneath a dark summer sky. Maybe the red, white, and blue decorations are still hanging from the porch. Turn the volume up, because for this special Independence Weekend transmission, we're opening the American File. And the first thing inside it is a story about George Washington, a winter at Valley Forge, and a visitor who supposedly showed him the future of the country he was fighting to create. The story is known as Washington's Vision, and according to the legend, it happened during one of the darkest moments of the American Revolution. The Continental Army was at Valley Forge. Washington's men were exhausted. Supplies were short. Clothing was inadequate. The army was struggling to hold itself together, and the future of the revolution was anything but certain. It's easy for us 250 years later to look backward and see the American Revolution as a finished story. Washington wins. The colonies gain independence. The Constitution follows. The United States grows. Roll credits. But the people living through it didn't know the ending. Washington didn't know the ending. There were nights at Valley Forge when the entire experiment could have collapsed, and that is where the legend places him, alone, troubled, deep in thought. According to the story, Washington was sitting at a table when he became aware of a mysterious presence. A woman, not a soldier, not an aide, not a visitor who had been announced. A strange, beautiful female figure standing before him. Washington supposedly spoke to her. She did not answer. He tried again. Still nothing. And then the atmosphere in the room seemed to change. The mysterious woman raised her arm, and Washington was shown America. Not the America of 1777, the America that had not happened yet. I pulled the old Washington Vision account from the file tonight, and when you read through it, the thing that immediately jumps out is the structure of what Washington is supposedly shown. 3 great perils, 3 moments when the United States would be pushed toward destruction. In the first, clouds and conflict gather over the young nation. In the second, America turns against itself, region against region, citizen against citizen, brother against brother. And then there is the third, the darkest vision, a future danger arriving from beyond America's shores, armies moving against the nation, cities and countryside caught in violence, the United States nearly overwhelmed before somehow rising again. And through all three visions, the message is essentially the same. The nation will suffer, the nation will be tested, but the nation will survive. Now, if you're hearing that story for the first time, you can understand why people have carried it forward. The first peril becomes the revolution. The second becomes the Civil War. And that third vision? That's where the theories begin. Some have connected it to the World Wars, others to a future invasion of the United States. Some believe the final part of Washington's vision hasn't happened yet. And whenever the country enters a time of uncertainty, the story seems to find a new audience. People rediscover it. They pass it around. They read the words again. Washington saw this coming. Washington was warned. Washington knew America would face three great dangers. There's just one very large problem. The story did not come from George Washington. The account that became known as Washington's Vision was published in 1861, not 1777. 1861. America was entering the Civil War. The country really was tearing itself apart. The story was written by Charles Wesley Alexander using the name Wesley Bradshaw, and the account was constructed as a piece of fiction. Inside the story, the narrator meets an elderly Revolutionary War veteran named Anthony Sherman, who then tells the story of Washington's mysterious experience. It sounds like testimony. It feels like an old veteran passing along something he personally remembers. But it was fiction. And I think that's where this story becomes even more interesting, because Washington's vision may not be a genuine prophecy from Valley Forge, but it tells us something about America in 1861, a country already old enough to have legends, a country staring into another terrible war, and a writer reaching back to George Washington and creating a story that said America had been warned about this, maybe even destined to face it. The vision was written nearly a century after Valley Forge, but people kept believing it. And 250 years after the Declaration of Independence, they're still reading it. Maybe that's because every country creates ghost stories about its birth. And sometimes the ghost isn't a dead person. Sometimes it's an idea. The idea that somebody at the beginning knew what was coming. The idea that the whole story had already been seen. And the idea that America, no matter how badly wounded, was somehow meant to survive. But Washington's supposed vision isn't the only strange symbol connected to the founding of the country.
Maybe George Washington never saw America's future at Valley Forge, but sometimes a nation believes a prophecy because the warning feels more real than the history.
For the second file tonight, you really don't have to travel anywhere. You don't have to walk into an old fort. You don't have to visit a battlefield. You may have the mystery in your wallet right now. Take out a $1 bill, turn it over, and look at that pyramid. 13 levels, unfinished at the top. Above it, an eye inside the triangle, light surrounding it, Latin words overhead, another Latin phrase beneath, and the year 1776 carved into the base in Roman numerals. This is the reverse of the Great Seal of the United States. And for generations, people have looked at it and asked one very simple question. What exactly are we looking at? The history begins appropriately enough on July 4th, 1776. Just hours after the Declaration of Independence was adopted, Congress appointed Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams to begin developing a seal for the new United States. Think about that for a moment. The country had barely announced that it intended to exist. The war was still being fought. The future was completely uncertain, and already the founders understood the importance of a symbol, a seal, an image that could represent this new thing they were trying to create. But the design didn't come together quickly. Different committees worked on it. Ideas were proposed and rejected. Elements were changed. And finally, in 1782, the Great Seal was adopted. On one side, the bald eagle, the shield, the olive branch, the arrows, the stars, images most Americans immediately recognize. But it's the other side that keeps showing up in conspiracy files. I've got the official design notes pulled out here, and there it is. An unfinished pyramid of 13 steps. At its base, the Roman numerals for 1776. Above the pyramid, the Eye of Providence. The motto, Annuit Coeptes, traditionally understood as a reference to Providence favoring the undertaking. Below the pyramid, Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order of the ages. Now, say those words slowly late at night. A new order of the ages. Put that beneath a pyramid. Place an eye above it. And then act surprised when 200 years of conspiracy theorists start getting ideas. The theories have connected the Great Seal to Freemasonry, the Illuminati, ancient mystery schools, Egyptian symbolism, secret knowledge carried from Europe into the American colonies. Some theories claim the unfinished pyramid represents a plan that was never completed. Others say the missing top is waiting for a final piece, a transformation, a new phase of government, a new world order. The eye has been interpreted as surveillance, hidden rulers, a secret power watching from above. And 1776 itself has been dragged into theories involving the Bavarian Illuminati, which was also founded that year. That's the thing about symbols. Once you create one, you lose some control over it. The official explanation is not difficult to find. The pyramid represents strength and duration. The 13 levels connect to the original states. The eye represents providence. The mottos speak to the founding of a new American era. And one important point often gets buried in the conspiracy versions. The Eye of Providence was not some unknown emblem that suddenly appeared in a secret American ritual. The image existed in religious and European symbolism before the final Great Seal was created. Even Masonic historians have pointed out that while the all-seeing eye became part of Masonic symbolism, the pyramid itself is not a standard Masonic emblem, and Benjamin Franklin's original seal proposal did not become the final design. But here's the part that fascinates me. None of that makes the Great Seal feel less strange. Maybe it should, but it doesn't. There is something about that unfinished pyramid, something about the eye suspended above it, something about the words, a new order of the ages. And maybe what we're reacting to isn't evidence of an occult conspiracy. Maybe we're reacting to something much simpler. The founders understood symbolism. They understood that they were not merely starting a government. They believed they were beginning an era, a new nation, a new experiment, a new place in history. And they chose symbols large enough to carry that idea. The problem is, powerful symbols cast long shadows, and America has spent 250 years trying to decide what might be hiding inside those shadows. Washington's vision gave us the idea that America's future had been seen. The Great Seal gave us the idea that America's future had been designed.
An unfinished pyramid stands beneath a watching eye, carrying the year 1776 into every generation that comes after. Symbols may be created by men, but the shadows they cast can outlive their makers.
But our third story tonight, we leave prophecy and symbols behind, and we look at a date, July 4th. Because for 3 early American presidents, Independence Day became something else. It became the day they died. Thomas Jefferson died on July 4th, 1826. John Adams died on July 4th, 1826. The same day, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. 5 years later, James Monroe died on July 4th, 1831. 3 presidents, 3 founders of the early American Republic. One date. Now, coincidence is a powerful thing. Given enough people, enough years, and enough dates on a calendar, strange patterns will happen. We know that. But every once in a while, coincidence creates something so perfectly arranged that even the logical part of your mind takes a step backward. Jefferson and Adams are the heart of this mystery. These were two men whose lives had been tangled together through revolution, diplomacy, politics, friendship, and bitter disagreement. They had been allies. They had become political rivals. Their relationship had fractured. And then, later in life, the two men began corresponding again. Two aging founders writing letters across the distance between Massachusetts and Virginia. Looking backward, talking about revolution, government, religion, aging, the world they had helped create. And then came July 4th, 1826, 50 years after the Declaration. I've got the dates from the file right here in front of me. Jefferson, Monticello, Virginia, July 4th, 1826. Adams, Quincy, Massachusetts, July 4th, 1826. Then James Monroe, New York City, July 4th, 1831. When you put them together on one page, it almost looks wrong, like somebody writing historical fiction decided the symbolism wasn't obvious enough and forced the ending. But those are the dates. Jefferson and Adams did not know the other had died that day. News did not travel instantly in 1826. There were no phones, no radio, no television, no notification appearing on a screen. Two former presidents, hundreds of miles apart, reached the end of their lives on the nation's 50th birthday. And then Monroe followed them exactly 5 years later. So what do we call that? The July 4th curse? Providence? Synchronicity? Or one of those patterns that history occasionally creates without explanation? There were people at the time who saw meaning in it. Of course they did. America in the earliest 19th century was still defining its own national story. The revolution was moving from living memory into history. The men who had created the country were disappearing, and suddenly, two of the most important voices of the founding generation died on the day Americans celebrated the birth of the nation. Not one, two, on the 50th anniversary. If that happened today, imagine the theories. Imagine social media. Imagine the videos, the timelines, the numerology. People would be examining the exact time of death, room numbers, family names, Masonic connections, astronomical positions, and probably the flight path of 3 unidentified objects over Virginia. And then, when Monroe died on July 4th, 5 years later, the internet would simply burst into flames. I don't know that there's anything paranormal here. I don't know that there has to be. Sometimes a historical coincidence is powerful because it actually happened. Jefferson, Adams, Monroe, 3 presidents, 1 date. And every year when fireworks explode over America, the anniversary of the country's birth is also the anniversary of their deaths. From there, we're moving into darker territory.
3 presidents died on the day America celebrates its birth, and 2 of them left this world on the very same anniversary. Coincidence may explain the dates, but history could hardly have written a stranger ending.
Down the Delaware River, to a place where American history was not written with ink. It was written with cannon fire. Fort Mifflin. During the Revolutionary War, the Delaware River was critical. The British had occupied Philadelphia. But controlling the city and supplying the city were 2 different things. The river defenses became an enormous problem. And Fort Mifflin, sitting on what was then Mud Island, stood in the way. In 1777, the fort came under a devastating British bombardment. Cannon fire, naval guns, exploding shells, days of violence. American defenders continued holding the position while the fort was slowly torn apart around them. Walls were smashed, buildings damaged, men killed and wounded, and finally, in November, the surviving defenders evacuated. The British took the fort, but the resistance had cost them time. That is why Fort Mifflin is sometimes remembered as the fort that saved America. Maybe that's a dramatic title, but the strategic delay mattered. The larger Philadelphia campaign mattered, and the men inside that fort endured one of the most brutal bombardments of the war. When a place absorbs that much fear, violence, pain, and death, paranormal stories usually follow. Fort Mifflin has plenty. In fact, the fort itself does not exactly run away from its haunted reputation. I've got the Fort Mifflin paranormal material pulled from the file here, and the organization openly invites investigators and visitors to explore the intersection of history and mystery. Their basic question is perfect. Is Fort Mifflin haunted? They let you decide. But the investigators and visitors have reported voices, footsteps, shadow figures, apparitions in military clothing, strange sensations inside the casemates, and screams. The most famous legend may be the screaming woman. For years, people have described hearing the sound of a woman crying out somewhere inside the fort. Not a faint sound, not something you have to convince yourself you're hearing, a scream, a woman's voice filled with grief. The spirit is often identified in the folklore as Elizabeth Pratt. And this is where we have to be careful, because the ghost story has changed over time. Different versions give different tragedies. Some versions claim a daughter died. Some say Elizabeth took her own life. Other historical research connected with the fort has challenged parts of that familiar story. And that's something we run into constantly on the Shadow Frequency. The haunting remains. The story explaining the haunting changes, but people keep hearing the scream. Then there is the Faceless Man, a figure reportedly seen in or around the dark casemates, and some connect the apparition to William H. Howe, a Union soldier imprisoned at Fort Mifflin during the Civil War and executed there in 1864. Howe's actual story is dark enough without adding a ghost. He was convicted of desertion and murder. He was held at the fort. He was hanged, and his name, carved into the wall of his cell, has been identified as part of the fort's surviving history. In the paranormal accounts, the figure associated with him is sometimes described as having no visible face, a human shape, military clothing, but where the features should be, nothing. Now imagine investigating that place after dark. Stone corridors, old casemates, the Delaware nearby, aircraft in the distance reminding you that modern Philadelphia is right there. And then you walk into a room where men were once confined. Your flashlight moves across the wall. You see old markings, names, scratches, pieces of human history cut directly into the structure. And somewhere behind you, footsteps. That's what makes Fort Mifflin so effective as a haunted location. The history doesn't need decoration. The fort was bombarded during the Revolution. It became a prison during the Civil War. Men suffered there. People died there. Generation after generation occupied the same walls. The paranormal claims are layered over genuine trauma. Could the sounds be old buildings settling? Aircraft? Water? Animals? The human mind reacting to darkness and suggestion? Absolutely. But then someone hears a scream. Someone sees a figure. Someone enters a casemate knowing nothing about the story and describes the same thing others have reported. And the file stays open. 250 years after the Declaration of Independence, Fort Mifflin still stands. The British guns are silent. The soldiers are gone. But according to some who have walked those grounds after dark, the fort may not be empty.
The cannons went silent centuries ago, but some say the fort still carries the screams, footsteps, and shadows of those who suffered there. Maybe old walls do not remember the dead, but sometimes they seem unwilling to let them go.
And that leaves us with one final stop tonight, Philadelphia, Independence Hall. There are places where history happened, and then there are places where history almost feels physically present. Independence Hall is one of those places. Walk into the assembly room and you are standing in a space connected directly to the creation of the United States. The Declaration of Independence was debated and adopted there. Years later, the United States Constitution was debated and signed in the same building. George Washington stood there. Benjamin Franklin sat there. Thomas Jefferson walked through those rooms. Men argued, compromised, disagreed, sweated through Philadelphia summers, and made decisions that would outlive every person in the building. We tend to turn historical figures into paintings, into statues, into faces on money. It's easy to forget they were physical people. They had voices. They coughed. They laughed. They became irritated. They walked across floors. They opened doors. They sat in chairs. And for a period of time, the rooms of Independence Hall knew the sound of them. Then one by one, those voices disappeared. At least, officially. I pulled my Independence Hall notes from the file for our final story, and the history is beyond dispute. This was the Pennsylvania State House, and it became the meeting place of the Second Continental Congress. The Declaration was approved there in 1776. The Constitution was debated and signed there in 1787. But the paranormal stories belong to another category. Philadelphia ghost lore has long attached famous names to Independence Hall. Benjamin Franklin is one that appears most often. Visitors and storytellers have described an apparition resembling Franklin inside the building. Sometimes he is placed in the assembly room. Sometimes the figure is said to move through the historic space as if still inspecting the work done there. Other stories add George Washington, and even Benedict Arnold appears in some versions of the folklore, wandering a building with which his ghost has no obvious reason to remain. That's the trouble with ghost stories surrounding famous places. The dead become celebrities. Every unidentifiable colonial figure eventually turns into Franklin. Every tall officer becomes Washington. Every gloomy-looking 18th century man apparently has a 50-50 chance of becoming Benedict Arnold. And I'm being a little funny about that, but it raises a serious question. When you enter a place like Independence Hall, can you really separate the atmosphere from the expectation? You know what happened there. You know the names. You know the paintings. You've seen the room in documentaries and history books. If you catch movement from the corner of your eye, your brain already has a cast of characters waiting. But maybe that cuts both ways, because buildings remember people in ordinary ways. A worn step, a groove in the floor, a fingerprint trapped beneath old paint, a name scratched into wood. The physical marks remain after the person is gone. So paranormal investigators ask a larger question. Could something else remain too? Could intense human experience leave an imprint we don't yet understand? Not a conscious ghost, not Benjamin Franklin waking up every night deciding to take another lap around the assembly room. An echo, a recording, a fragment of movement somehow tied to a place. The theory is sometimes called a residual haunting, an event or presence repeating without awareness, history caught in a loop. And if such a thing exists, where would you expect to find it? An ordinary empty office building constructed 15 years ago? Or a room where men sat during the creation of a country? Think about July 1776, the heat, the tension, war already underway, the possibility that signing or supporting independence could end in failure, prison, execution, the colonies crushed. The men in that room did not know Americans would still be celebrating the 4th of July 250 years later. They had no guarantee there would be a United States in 10 years, let alone 2.5 centuries. They were inside the moment, and maybe that's what people feel when they visit Independence Hall. Maybe it isn't a ghost, maybe it's history, real history. The understanding that the room existed before us and will probably exist after us. That people stood there and made decisions which continued moving forward long after their bodies were gone. Or maybe, every now and then, one of them still walks through. Maybe somebody catches the shape of a man in colonial clothing. Maybe there's movement near the assembly room. Maybe an old figure appears for just a second and is gone before the witness completely understands what they've seen. And because this is the shadow frequency, we're not going to tell you which answer to choose. That's never really been the point. The point is to open the file, put the history on the table, listen to the stories, and decide for yourself.
Independence Hall. The founders became portraits, statues, names, and history books. But once they were living men walking those rooms. And perhaps every now and then, history still gets up and walks the halls.
Washington's mysterious vision of America's future. the Eye watching over an unfinished pyramid, 3 presidents dying on the 4th of July, the screams and shadow figures of Fort Mifflin, and the possibility that the founders still walk through Independence Hall. 5 stories, 5 pieces of American folklore, mystery, coincidence, and paranormal history. And remember that after 250 years, the story of the United States is filled with shadows, some created by history, some created by legend, and maybe a few created by something we haven't explained yet. That's going to close out this special Independence Weekend edition of the Shadow Frequency. Juniper and Chris have had this one off, but we'll be back to our regular format next time. You can find the Shadow Frequency at shadowfrequencypodcast.com, where you can catch up on past episodes, explore the show notes and blog posts, and follow the signal deeper into the strange, the unexplained, and the stories that refuse to stay buried. You can also find us on Facebook, of course, YouTube, and TikTok, and Rumble as well. I hope you and your family had a fun and safe 4th of July weekend. And on this historic anniversary, happy 250th birthday to the United States of America. 250 years, a quarter of a millennium. Still arguing, still changing, still moving forward, and apparently still haunted. I'm Matt Wilson. This has been the Shadow Frequency. Until next time, keep the signal grounded and the shadows wired.
This episode was conjured with a solemn vow to explore the unexplained while remaining bound to the truths that have been unearthed. All interpretations are speculative and offered only for your enlightenment and your entertainment.